Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome back to my channel. Today, apart from being attacked by some sunlight, I really wanted to look at some of the other books from Booker Prize shortlisted authors. Now, we're at that stage of the year where these Booker Prize authors have been sort of celebrated and people are reading their books and, I really hope that people are enjoying the Booker shortlist so far. But I thought it could be quite interesting to read a few others by those same authors. And this is possible this year, it's sort of just because none of them are debut authors, at least not in the sort of traditional sense. Patricia Lockwood, this is her first novel, but she has written other books before, including poetry and a memoir. So as a result, there is an option to be able to talk about some of these Booker Prize shortlisted books and their authors and other works by those exact same authors. So let's go. Temporarily solved the light issue with some of just a pile of books just blocking the sun there. Anyway, so I wanted to look at some of the other books by these shortlisted authors, and it's been a really exciting thing actually to kind of have a look at these sort of B-sides, as it were, of them, because I think one thing that's so brilliant about prizes and book prizes sort of in general is this sort of discovering new authors, or at least new to you authors, and then as a result having a bit of a chance to go back and read their back catalogues, because some of these authors have been putting out work for years and years, and it might only be sort of later in their careers that they get nominated or shortlisted for something like the Booker or any other book prize. Take for example Bernardine Evaristo. Girl, Woman, Other won the prize in 2019, and she'd been writing for years, but she sort of was a fairly I don't want to say unknown author. She wasn't unknown, but for many people, she just, her books hadn't sort of necessarily sold that well, or she was sort of a bit of a sleeper hit, right? And so it's exciting to see when authors kind of get that bit of limelight, and as a result, people then go back and read a bit more of their stuff. So I've looked at 6 books from these shortlisted authors, and let's go through them, starting with Anuk Arudpragasam, and so he has been shortlisted for his second book, Passage North. I have a separate video about it. I loved this book. I thought it was beautiful, and the thing that is so interesting about it, about Passage North, is the sort of slow meandering style and the way that allows him to go in depth about various topics, and that's something that I was quite excited to see whether any of his other work did that. And his first novel, A Story of a Brief Marriage, in some ways feels like that kind of mingling of those two things. So we start off with this story being sort of set in sort of midst of war in Sri Lanka, and this is a sort of situation where there is this couple who are together or sort of introduced to each other and get married quite early into the book, and they are our brief marriage. And obviously the title right from the beginning lets you know that this is maybe not going to go well, given that it's a brief marriage. We don't know at this stage whether that marriage is going to end because of, a divorce, because these two people don't see eye to eye, whether it's because of death, whether because one person is taken away, or anything like that. And this book, in some ways, is so interesting to kind of see alongside A Passage North, because we can see how there is this sort of circular, sort of lengthy sentence, sort of rambling, meditative style that we also see in A Passage North. But there's also something really interesting about it. This is a little bit more plot-driven than A Passage North is. A Passage North is a little bit more focused on kind of interiority, the sort of inner life of this character. And we do get a fair bit of that in A Story of a Brief Marriage. But what I thought was so interesting and affecting about this book is how we really trace these two characters, and particularly we're sort of told it through one main character, and he is trying to make sense of the war around him as much as anyone can make sense of a war. And it is so fascinating to watch how bit by bit he is sort of just broken down, and he can't quite deal with the rest of this world around him, and he sort of equally is trying to make sense of his marriage. He's been married to this woman who he basically doesn't know. It's sort of some form of kind of arranged marriage, or sort of marriage of convenience in some way. And so these two characters are trying to navigate a war and being in a camp together whilst barely knowing each other. And there are these really profound and touching moments, I think, throughout the book where, for example, this narrator, for example, wants to try and at one point have sex with his wife, but kind of suddenly finds that he's so overwhelmed by everything else that he can't perform. And he suddenly breaks down because for him, he sort of feels almost, well, if I can't do this, what can I do? Because everything else has been taken away from him in this camp, in this world, everywhere, and it's just exhausting for him. And there are so many other passages like that where it's sort of just watching as a character slowly crumbles and loses all ability to really process what's going on around them. So I thought this was a really beautiful book. I think I still overall, maybe A Passage North, I still sort of prefer in some ways, but I thought Story of a Brief Marriage, I just thought it has so many beautiful moments, and it's really great to see that style and that kind of the sort of growth of this writer as well. I mean, I think A Passage North, if I'm right, is only his second novel, and I've enjoyed the two books of his I've read so much, and I just think he's such an exciting talent. He is just so incisive and insightful, and just has these really beautiful turns of phrase, all alongside some absolutely heartbreaking sort of reality in the war. And I saw an article that the author sort of gave a quote for, and he was talking about the process of writing A Passage North, and how actually in A Passage North, you know, the thing that I really love about the book, and I know that some people really like this and some people really dislike it, is there's a distance. It does feel like we're watching someone watch the scenes unfold around them through a window, sort of powerless to almost affect it. And Arudpragasam, in an interview, mentions how in Story of a Brief Marriage, those sorts of ideas, he felt a bit more able to kind of really go into the sort of the physicality of it and the violence of it and the brutality of it. But when he came to write A Passage North, he kept on finding that he almost wanted to inject those moments in, but was really struggling with processing it. And this is something that comes out so beautifully, I think, in this book. Is, you know, we've got the brutality in Story of a Brief Marriage, and then in A Passage North, we've got someone almost unable to deal with that physicality and brutality anymore, and has to sort of have a real distance from it. So I think these two books sit so beautifully side by side, because they cover in some ways similar topics, but from really different perspectives, and I just think they're both brilliant. So yeah. Next up is Damon Galgut. So he's shortlisted this year for The Promise, and a book, I mean, I've spoken about this book so much, and in some ways I almost feel like I'm cheating by using this example, but Damon Galgut's In a Strange Room, which was shortlisted for the 2010 Booker Prize, and I just think is an absolute triumph. This is possibly one of my favourite books from the last few years. I read it probably not long after it came out, and then almost forgot about it. I just didn't know what book it was that I'd read, so I heard the name Damon Galgut later and it didn't sort of register. And I reread In a Strange Room, not knowing that I'd read it before. I sort of slowly twigged that I had read it. And I adore this book. This book it's kind of hard to sort of pinpoint in some ways, but it is split across 3 different sort of sections that all deal with, in some ways, different characters, but there's sort of a unifying character and sort of person throughout it. And in many ways, it's a book that's full of silence and full of quiet and stillness. And that sounds really pretentious and silly to say, but it's a book that's very spare in its language. It's something that I really enjoyed about The Promise, and it is how Galgut can sort of use a turn of phrase and sort of say quite a lot in very few words. In a Strange Room is almost entirely that. It's a very spare and sparse novel, and I just think it's gorgeous. So the first sort of part, and I think this is the part that I found most affecting, is this this man sort of backpacking, like young man backpacking, and he meets these sort of people, and there's all of this kind of unspokenness to their language. Nobody really wants to reveal what they actually feel about anything. And so what we get is lots of sort of quiet, unspoken moments. And for example, there is a sort of a queer subtext between this sort of central character and a German man he meets while he's backpacking. And neither of them can really say what it is that they feel, but they will happily sort of go hiking for a whole day with each other, or backpacking or whatever. They will spend all this time together, not really speaking about anything, kind of a very silent time. And again, this factors into that sort of silence of the book. And what I think is just so beautiful about it is that really, for me, expresses that kind of unknowingness and of kind of queer desire and longing, that neither character really wants to say how they feel, because to do so is to expose yourself to extreme vulnerability. And because these two characters have been getting on so well, they don't want to spoil this sort of perfect holiday romance, friendship, whatever it is. But it's clear that these two men are so intricately linked, and their lives have intersected so perfectly at that exact moment. But there's a real terror that at any moment, if any of them were to step away, this moment is lost. This whole thing that they've constructed together, the second one of them either says anything out loud, or the second one of them goes home, it is lost forever. It's a very unique moment that's only taking place then. And so both men are really trying to get the most out of it. And then it sort of segues into some other bits, which involve a lot of people. I mean, again, not the cheeriest perhaps, but you know, there's a particularly brutal section around someone who wants to take their own life. And it's woven in this real kind of, the narrator of the book is so distant in some ways, and at first that feels quite difficult as a reader, but actually you sort of slowly realize that's the only way that they can deal with the reality of everything around them. And in some ways there's a nice interesting link to Arudpragasam. I find it so impressive how both authors are able to create this voice that is at once so distant, but also really invites you into the inner lives of their characters. Next up is Patricia Lockwood. So she, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, this is her first novel. No one is talking about this. Shortlisted for this year's Booker and shortlisted for the Women's Prize as well. And it's a book that I think, you know, has ruffled some feathers. Some people don't necessarily get on with it that well. And I can understand that. It's quite a divisive book in some ways. And I get that it doesn't necessarily appeal to everyone. I don't think it's perfect necessarily by any means. I do really enjoy it. I think it has some really clever things to say about sort of digital worlds, about identity. I think it's a really fascinating perspective, and just quite a funny book as well, despite some of the tragedy in the book as well. I think there are some really good reviews out there of it. Larry has opinions, has his own review with the most terrifying thumbnail known to man, which I think is a really good, interesting and nuanced take on the book. And there are many, many other good ones out there. I'm not saying mine's good, but in my Women's Prize wrap-up video, I also talk a bit about the book as well. But reading another book by her, I was quite excited to kind of see what it's like when she writes about other topics, because No One Is Talking About This is so internet and meme heavy that you kind of both really get a strong sense of Patricia Lockwood's point of view, but also it's difficult because that point of view is so enmeshed with a point of view of many other people, of, you know, the internet. And so it was really interesting to read her memoir, Priestdaddy, which is firstly a great title. And this book is her memoir of essentially her relationship with her father, with her family more generally, with religion, with her husband. It kind of does a lot. It's a really interesting book. And I listened to the audio of this, which is really brilliant and entertaining for many reasons. Firstly, that Lockwood reads it, and so you really get a sense of how she wants those jokes to land, because some of them, I mean, it's hilarious. I adored this. It's so funny and witty. I think it's actually a really good accompaniment again to No One Is Talking About This, because I think you can see Lockwood's point of view and her sense of humour so strongly throughout the book. It's so funny to me. For example, there's just this, like, so many absurd moments. So I mean, I guess if absurdist humor doesn't really work for you, or kind of silly, nerdy humor doesn't necessarily work for you, this may not be the book for you. And if you, similarly, if you found no humor or very little humor in No One Is Talking About This, you might not enjoy Priestdaddy. But I think this book is brilliant. At times it's really tender and powerful and sad as she sort of confronts some realities in her life. But again, sort of similar to No One Is Talking About This, those moments of tragedy are paired with absolute absurdity and silliness. And it almost just feels like camp as a book. It's brilliant. So there's this moment, for example, where Patricia Lockwood and her mother are have gone to a motel, and there's this whole sort of discussion in Patricia Lockwood's head about motel versus hotel and all these sorts of things. And she kind of goes off on these little tangents. And then her mother, who in many ways throughout the book is presented as quite a straight-laced kind of figure, suddenly starts really worrying about, trying to think how to phrase this sort of delicately, ejaculate over the kind of motel bed. She's sort of convinced that she'll find it in the sheets. And I remember I was walking home from work, just sort of listening to this, being like, what is happening? You know, those sort of moments where you sort of are very much sort of hoping that your headphones, you know, it's very much in your own headphones. It's not playing out loud on a crowded train, or anything, because, or, you know, out in the street, because it's, this whole moment goes on for sort of a good few minutes with Lockwood. Just, you can hear her, even as she's narrating it, trying to hold in that laughter as she's sort of confronting the absurdity of the situation, that her mother, who is so sort of straight-laced and does not talk about these sorts of things, is having a full-on rant and sort of meltdown about this being on the bed sheets. And I know that seems like such a sort of puerile and sort of silly thing that you might be like, oh, come on, this is just sort of, this is, you know, sort of grim humor. It's balanced as well by so many other moments in this book that I found really genuinely witty and great. I loved this so much, and I think I now really want to go back and read a lot more of her poetry, for example, because she references her poetry quite a lot. She talks about the process of becoming a writer, and sort of seeing her books in bookshops for the first time, and how big a moment that was. And it's interesting because those moments of real sort of Lockwood's real life are balanced against you know, some sort of discussions about religion and spirituality and belief and her family and her relationship with her parents, and then these silly jokes. And I loved it. I just think it's really clever, and I think it's also interesting because it's given me more appreciation for No One Is Talking About This. I feel like I enjoy the thought of that book a lot more now, because I kind of have a little bit more of a sense of Lockwood's point of view and her sort of absurd sense of humor that at times, and No One Is Talking About This, can feel quite difficult to gauge. You know, how serious is she? How much is she joking? But actually, the more you think about it after this, you're like, oh yeah, she's done some really clever and brilliant things here. Yeah, really keen to read more of Lockwood's work, definitely, both sort of old work and anything she releases now in the future. I think I may be sold on her. Next up is Nadifa Mohamed, shortlisted this year for her book The Fortune Men, and the book of hers, sort of a previous book of hers that I've decided to read, is Black Mamba Boy. And this book, in many ways, was really interesting to have again as a pair with her other work, with The Fortune Men, because firstly, at one point, a character in the book uses the phrase fortune men, towards the end says that they want to become one of those fortune men. And I sort of had a moment of like, hang on, has she predicted this? Is this? But I think it's, you know, that kind of phrasing was used, and it's, you know, a really important part of that kind of that time. And what is really interesting about this book is this is another book where Nadifa Mohamed essentially weaves in real life story in a kind of semi-fictional way. So, you know, The Fortune Men, we have a real life trial, and Nadifa Mohamed brings it to life in a sort of way, you know, not necessarily creating characters as such, but maybe creating some of the words they may have said, kind of creating an image of what Cardiff would have looked like. In this book, we have the story of her own father, and we watch as her father basically toils and troubles and everything to kind of try and improve his lot. But at the same time, this is happening during the war. And so, you know, there's a lot of talk about empire and fascism, particularly with Somalia and its history of empire with Italy, and you know, sort of being colonized by Italy, and you have sort of moments of British colonies as well, sort of referenced, and it's a really interesting thing to see how she weaves in the history there. But really, I think, again, like with the Fortune Men, what she does that's really quite remarkable is really give a proper voice to characters whose narratives have been left out of these sorts of stories in the past, sort of traditionally. So actually, we don't often hear, for example, about the lives of the Somali community in the UK, particularly in Cardiff, in the Fortune Men. But we also don't necessarily hear the lives of Somali migrants coming to the UK. And this book ends, interestingly, with, I mean, this is not a spoiler in some ways, because, I mean, it's a real life story, and she sort of references it a little bit at the end of the Fortune Men. But this is the story, essentially, of how her father came to be in the UK, and particularly in Wales. And so the book ends with this character, well, with her father in Wales, or at least sort of, he's just about to leave to go somewhere else. Spoiler. But it's really interesting, and I think this is, I mean, I think with both books, her writing style is really interesting. She is really great at snatches of dialogue between characters, and I really found the voice of this so intriguing and charming. She describes Somalia, I mean, I've never been, but she describes it so beautifully, and she also gives a real sort of dignity to her characters, who are facing some of the most horrible things that humans can face. And she does it in a way that really, you get to the end and these characters really do feel like they have been on a proper journey. And you know, that's especially given that she's writing about real life people. Again, it's really fascinating to see how she's managed to pull this off. So I was really pleasantly surprised by this, because I had no idea what else to expect from her work. And it's really interesting to see how she has, at least in these two books, really given a voice to a community who is not often represented that much in English language literature. So yeah, really, really interesting. Next up, we have Richard Powers. So he is shortlisted this year for Bewilderment, a book that focuses a lot on the environment, and particularly the idea of memory and feelings and emotions, and how those things interact with the natural world. And in many ways, it therefore felt quite fitting to read a book of his that he is very well known for, his last shortlisted book from the Booker, The Overstory. This book, I think, also, if I'm right, won the Pulitzer. It's, you know, it's kind of seen as one of his sort of substantial and bigger pieces of work. It's also about 500 pages, so it is physically his biggest work, I think. But this is a story, it's kind of an interconnected story of many characters who are in some way linked or involved with trees or the natural world, but particularly trees. As you may know, I am a lover of nature and of trees, particularly. Thank you, Larry. For Larry always jokes that basically if it's got a tree in it, I give it 5 stars. I almost feel like, to spite him, although it's also my genuine feeling, I gave Overstory 4 stars. Maybe there are too many trees. Is that a thing? I don't know. But Overstory, with all of these characters sort of interconnected, I think it does so many beautiful things within this book. It has these interlinked stories that in many ways just tell completely different sides of how people are reliant on the natural world, and particularly, again, trees. So one character is saved from his death when he falls out of a plane and sort of lands on a canopy of a tree, and sort of is sort of spared. You know, sort of takes away some of the impact. There are other characters who have also been sort of somewhat close to death, and trees have sort of been a way that trees have sort of healed them in some form. Either sort of it's helped their career, or it's been a source of inspiration, or it's been the thing that drives them, or the thing that brought them together with other people. And so these tree stories are really interesting, and it really, I think what's so beautiful about it is just watching Richard Powers and his enthusiasm and joy about trees and about the natural world as he writes. This book, I think, manages to incorporate quite a lot of real life bits of information, sort of statistics, or sort of scientific facts into this book without it feeling like it's overloaded. It's not the kind of Moby Dick effect where it's sort of, and now here's 30 pages about whale skeletons. You're like, great, thanks Melville. Whereas I think Richard Powers manages to pull this off really well because, for example, one of the characters is a researcher who will talk about her research on trees. And so it's a kind of clever way of introducing those facts in a way that never loses a sense of wonder. And I think that's what's so powerful about this book is it's full of wonder. And like with Bewilderment, it has a sense of hope, ultimately, that is sort of threaded through it. And I found this book really quite compelling. I think maybe I did find it a bit overly long, and maybe I wasn't as fully bought into all of the the character stories, but I still think this is a really interesting book. And if you liked Bewilderment, I think you'll probably enjoy the Overstory as well. I know some people much prefer the Overstory to Bewilderment and see Bewilderment as an offshoot of one of the, one potential story from the Overstory. I think either way, they're both really interesting books, and Richard Powers clearly just has the power of the pen when it comes to sort of these brilliant, beautiful sentences and the ability to imbue so many moments with hope and with passion and love. So yeah, I found this book really, really quite interesting and compelling. And last but not least, Maggie Shipstead. She is shortlisted this year for The Great Circle, a 600-page book about, well, about flights and about these two women over a sort of sense of period of time kind of interconnected. And now in Astonish Me, a book from a few years back, she details again sort of a woman sort of across various points in her life, but it's sort of the same woman, and I think it's done really compellingly in terms of this woman and her past relationships. She's a ballet dancer, and sort of involved in ballet, and there's this really interesting generational thing about the secrets that are kept and the secrets that we do tell. So there are things that she does not want revealed about her sort of quote unquote former life, but they slowly bleed into the sort of modern day narrative. And I think the writing in both is really sort of beautiful and strong. I think I still prefer A Great Circle. I think it feels like a slightly more sort of consistent and together novel for me personally, but I think Astonish Me is still so interesting. We watch this woman and how, I think what's really interesting is something like ballet or dance more generally, it's such an interesting field. It's not one I know anything about, particularly if you've ever seen me in a club, you'll know that I know nothing about dance. But the interesting thing about this book, I think, is that it somehow kind of captures that sort of cold, strategic almost discipline of something like ballet. That ballet can be this sort of very strange duality of, it's beautiful and stunning to watch, and it's sort of, there's so much emotion that's kind of carried through, but it's also so technical and so precise. And so these characters, ballet dancers train for years and years, and in the sort of pursuit of perfection to sort of nail absolutely every move, to have their leg at the exact right angle. And there's something about the way this book does that with language that I think is really clever. We get these passages that are long and flowing and sort of alive and vibrant, and then we also get these moments of sort of cold dialogue where these characters are struggling to understand each other because they're almost in that sort of locked down, disciplined mentality. So it's a really interesting book, and I think again another sort of interesting thing for if you have read A Great Circle and really enjoyed it, to kind of go and see sort of a little bit more of Maggie Shipstead's writing. I've heard that there are many other good works of hers, including one that was also longlisted for the Booker a few years back, which I'm keen to check out. But she just seems like a very interesting author, and I really want to see more from her. So I think bringing all of those together in this sort of B-side Booker, which is the official term, I'm probably going to get sued now, but if taking these 6 books, imagining this was a shortlist, and it's an unfair shortlist to make and put against each other because I've picked books from sort of all over these authors' careers, but I think it's really interesting to see this, because I would probably have either Damon Galgut's In a Strange Room, there we go. I love the book, yet somehow can never remember its name. Damon Galgut's In a Strange Room, or Patricia Lockwood's Priestdaddy, which both of them were 5-star reads for me. I just think they're both exquisite in their own ways. The other 4 books I've mentioned here, sort of from these other authors, I also think are brilliant. Just that I have these 2 favourites. But I'd be really keen to hear your thoughts. Have you read any other books by these Booker shortlisted authors that you would recommend? Who are you rooting for the Booker itself, for this year's Booker? And what other books would you recommend that are kind of similar to some of these? Love to hear those in the comments. I've been Bob, the Booker, rambling about the Booker Prize. There we go. Something new for us all. Take care and enjoy your reading. Bye-bye.